The lively noise of heavy machinery rumbles around as I continue to do my tedious job of installing the same few components onto every moving line of electronics on the conveyor belt. Looking to my sides, see the same old colleagues that I've grown accustomed to over the course of my 5 years of working in this factory. We all sit in contemplative silence as we continue to work our dead-end jobs that should have been replaced by machines long ago. To my left, I hear Gerald stretch his back once again with a small series of cracks as his hunched-over back finally straightens itself. This caused many others, including myself, to do the same. Just another few hours and I can go home for the weekend. Smiling to myself, I chat to my coworker on the left, Henry, about random things for a while. God, I wish I could get one of those cushy office jobs in the inner city, Henry told me like usual. I bet those bureaucratic asses upstairs haven't worked a real job in their lives, right, James? I laugh with him for a few moments before we fall back into that familiar silence. I went back to focusing on my work, which was installing the last few interior components onto the frame of a circuit board. A dozen or so minutes of working later, in a particularly less noisy moment, I hear a snap coming from the ceiling. Quickly raising my head to search for what caused the noise, I see a falling hang light heading straight for me and my fellow line worker. "Everyone scatter!" I yell out, rising to my feet. Many of my coworkers reacted quickly and jumped out of the crash zone, but Henry did not get up as fast as the rest. Before I realized what I was doing, I began sprinting over to Henry as fast as I could. Acting purely on instinct, I pull and shove Henry out of the way. Stepping forward to begin running out of the impact zone, I crash. "Ugh, my head," I groaned, reaching for my head and rubbing rhythmically to try and soothe the aching pain. After a few moments, I rip enough control away from the pain and open my eyes to a most peculiar sight. Whitish pink fluffy clouds all around and under me. The clouds were oddly stable and somewhat fluffy now that I felt it. Getting up from the ground, I glance around, searching for anything to explain my odd surroundings. My eyes finally landed on a desk occupied by two beings that looked not quite human. On the left was a red-skinned, horned man with a short, black combed back hair and beard. On the right was an angelic figure with a set of golden wings and a radiant halo floating above a woman's head. Hello, where am I? And what am I doing here? Also, who are you guys? And why are you dressed up like that? Halloween was months ago, I ask, genuinely confused. The red man speaks up first. So many questions. First, you are on the gateway between the afterlife and the mortal realm as you know it. Second, you are here because you died. Quite prematurely, I might add. Lastly, Lady Angelica and I are angels and devils, respectively, and thus we must dress accordingly. I start to chuckle for a moment. You must be joking. Seriously, where am I? I ask again, not believing that I died. This time, Angelica spoke up. Dominic was not joking. You have died, and now we are here to judge you. Starting off, she looks over to Dominic. He has committed a few too many sins to be brought up to heaven. Do you want him? Hey, I didn't do anything that bad, I say, but they seem to just ignore me. He seems a bit too innocent to be viable for a transfer to hell. Maybe we could just stick him on C-784. They seem to be running out of suitable dungeons aside from the pre-generated ones. Dominic answers. No objections here. Go ahead, Angelica replies. And with that, Dominic snaps his fingers and a magical-looking circle appears underneath me, and I begin to sink into it. I desperately try to claw my way out of the rapidly sinking hole, but to no avail. The last thing I see is the smiling faces and waves Angelica and Dominic give me as I depart. Well, crap. I look around the decrepit and dusty room that I now find myself in, which was illuminated by a few, very dim, lights. The room was quite large and had an assortment of various metallic furniture scattered around the room, which were completely covered in layers of dust that looked to have been accumulating for who knows how long. On one of the walls was a set of doors, which seemed to once have had a nice shade of blue, but currently it looked to have lost much of its vibrancy over the years. I begin to look downwards before I begin to realize what was wrong. Around where my legs should be was naught but dust and the hard concrete ground. I raise my hands up to my face to rub my eyes, only to find that my hands were gone as well. A few minutes of hyperventilating about the prospect of no longer having my body, I calmed myself down enough to take charge of my mind and to assess my situation. Experimentally, I try to grab onto a nearby desk, but my hands slip right through. I also try to walk forward like normal, and that leads to me gliding around the room with little to no control. Before hitting the wall, I begin to flail my arms. Trying to slow my approach, I actually slow down and eventually stop before hitting the wall. I begin moving my arms in a swimming motion, which does seem to move me a bit, but after more experimentation, I eventually figured out that I could just think to move towards where I wished to, which was a bit hard to control, but I soon got the hang of it. Looking around the room with my newfound mode of transport, I saw a few odd things like two surprisingly functional-looking machines in the corner of the room, and a few boxes strewn about the room, one of which was glowing with a faint blue hue. Focusing on the glowing metal container first, a screen located on one of the sides of the box lights up as I get close. On the screen, it displayed a loading bar and some text saying that it had detected a new AI administrator present, and that it had begun granting access to a new administrator. I was slightly confused for a few moments. I was an underpaid factory worker, not an administrator, much less an AI one. Before I could contemplate the sudden change of career and my now AI status, the metallic box opened up with a hiss. I looked inside of the box to see some kind of construction manual nestled at the bottom of the container. On the front cover of the manual was an image of some kind of arachnid-based robot. Then a small block of text appeared in front of me, displaying that I now possessed the blueprint for a general maintenance drone crawler variant. A drone, huh? Only a blueprint, but still could be useful. Although I have no idea how I'm going to pick up the manual seeing that I no longer have any of my limbs, let alone construct the whole bot. I barely understood how to operate my section of the production line. Corporate never really cared enough to train us on how to make the entire product. They only cared that we could complete our section of the circuit and then pass it over to the next sap in line. Then the machine sitting in the corner suddenly lights up, and I can hear the faint sounds of the internal mechanisms whirling back to life as if waking from a deep slumber. Drifting over to the machine, I see that it too has a screen, and upon detecting my presence, has the same lines of text stating that I now have been granted full access to the machine. Then the screen changes to display a menu-like list of all my drone blueprints, stated near the top of the menu. The top of the screen displayed that this machine was a small drone works, and on its right was a little question mark box. Clicking onto the little box with one of my invisible hands, an information tab appeared in front of the main screen. The information tab read that the small drone work was a smaller version of the standard medium drone work meant to create small basic drones. The tab also explained that it ran off of internal batteries and a small energy siphon which was able to pull in energy from the unit's surroundings, something its larger brethren could not sustain themselves on, although an external power source can increase efficiency in production. It stated that it could store a small amount of fabrication materials within itself and act as an emergency relay node for nearby drones if disconnected from their administrator AI, and a larger drone works is unavailable. Closing the information tab, I look to the main screen and see some indicators on the very right side showing that the small drone works currently had half of its storage capacity met. I also noticed on the left side of the screen was a section labeled as the drone production queue. Looking over to the right of my one and only blueprint's designation was 2 buttons and a 2-digit counter. The first button was placed right after my drone blueprint's designation and was another information display, and I made a note to myself to look at that after the next 2 things. The number counter was placed second to last and near the end of the drone blueprints tab, which had an arrow which pointed up and others which pointed down and were located above and below it, so I assumed that it was a counter for how many drones I wished to produce. The second button was on the very edge of the blueprints tab and had the word construct labeled on top of it, which was quite self-explanatory. Looking back to the information button, I once again click upon it, and the blueprints tab slides down to reveal a description of the drone. According to the description, the General Maintenance Drone Crawler variant, or just the GMDC, was a crawler variation of the GMD, which encompassed multiple distinct drones. The GMDC is primarily used for construction, as they are able to climb on sheer walls and scaffolding, and they can double as field repair units. With their sharp mandibles, they are able to cut off excess materials from scaffolding and other such thin metals. Huh? So I got a builder drone. Certainly could be helpful, although I doubt I'll be having them do any construction anytime soon, given that I don't exactly have any materials to do so. I clicked the arrow above the drone production counter a few times, but upon reaching the number 3, the center refused to go any further, citing the fact that I only had enough materials stored in the DroneWorks storage module. I selected the Construct button, and an image of the drone, with the number 3 in the bottom right corner, appeared in the queue on the left of the screen. As time slowly passed, a bar underneath the drone's image slowly began to fill up, and above the bar was a timer a couple minutes short of a dozen. Floating away from the screen, I move over to the other machine nearby, and it does the same as the DroneWorks and begins to authorize my access to itself. As it did its thing, I examined the exterior of the machine, which was for the most part just a large metal box with a funnel at the top of the machine and an exit shut at its bottom. Once its screen was done booting up, the screen displayed that it was a basic refinery fabricator, and it also had an information button which I promptly interacted with. The information tab explained that the basic refinery was a simpler version of the standard refinery. The basic refinery is able to take processed or unprocessed resources and is able to strip down or refine into usable base components. Closing out of the information tab, I turned to see that one of the drones had finished fabricating. The drone, as if noticing my presence, springs awake and scuttles over to me before stopping at where my feet would have been. The drone had 6 legs and a flat, boxy exterior with small mandibles which protruded from what I guessed was the frontal half of its chassis. On the back side of the drone was a small welder pointed downwards to the floor, and on all of its joints were small bulbs which gave off a faint blue light. Not really knowing what to do, I point over to the spider drone and then to the refinery, which it seems to perceive as an order to operate the machine, and so they begin to grab various small metal scraps and drop it into the refinery's funnel. As the scrap metal slides into the refinery, the machine whirls to life and begins to emit a faint glow. I continue to watch the spider drone work until the next drone finishes fabrication, and so I send them to open up the door opposite of the refinery and drone works. The spider drone dutifully crawls over to the door and looks up and seems to realize it is not tall enough to reach it. So the drone uses its little legs and plants them onto the door and begins to scale it. Once it reaches the door handle, it grabs onto it and slowly shifts it open by swinging a little bit. I give a pat on the head to the spider who opened the door as thanks, and the drone in question seems to stand a little bit higher. With the door open, I could now see into the next room, which was much larger than the one I came from. The room looked to be a slandered-looking factory floor with rows of conveyor belts which looked not functional, and graded walkways high above where the workers would have slaved away. On the ground floor were more chairs strewn about and other such scrap metal laying around on the floor. After looking around a bit more, I found the corpse of another drone of some kind, which had its insides spilled out of it. I tell my spider drone, which helped open the door, to go and help his slightly older brother in smelting down some of this scrap metal, and so it scampers off. I continued to watch as my drones slowly dragged the hunks of metal into the refinery, which spat out metal bars every so often. Every time that happened, I would order one of my spiders to DRSG the bar over and place it into the small drone works, which would allow me to queue up another spider. This continued on until eventually I had amassed a total of 8 spiders, which all moved about the building. I was beginning to nod off into sleep when I suddenly started hearing hurried footsteps outside of the larger room's double doors. I floated over just in time to see a strange form slide one of the 2 doors open. The strange figure was humanoid in form. However, they were not made of flesh and blood, but rather steel and wire. The robot was quite slim, enough so that I could probably have grabbed its torso at its thinnest point with both hands, and my fingers would have touched. If I still had my body, that is. The robot was painted a shade of aqua blue and had some sort of symbol, that being a circle which had been slashed in half down the middle of it. Then, I hear a yell originating from outside the factory, which seems to cause the blue robot to slam the door shut and run behind one of the many pushed-over desks at a far corner facing opposite the door. Not long after the blue robot gets into place, another robot bursts through the door and begins scanning the room, presumably for the blue robot. The newly arrived robot seemed to be of similar make to the first. However, they were significantly more bulky with hulking arms and legs and a sizable torso. This robot also had the same symbol, however they were colored red, with a few small dashes of purple mixed in. The red robot also possessed a large club which they were occasionally thumping in their hand. The blue robot seemed to be afraid of the red one, as they looked to be quivering with fear now that the red robot had entered the room. To be entirely fair, if a person nearly double my size was chasing me down with a club, I would be afraid as well. The red robot seemed to have finished scanning the room and shouted out, "Come out already, GW3N, I know you're here. There's no point in delaying this any longer, but if you insist, I will find you eventually." This only seemed to make the blue robot quiver even more. Then the red robot started to move about the room, methodically checking each and every possible hiding spot in the room. Slowly but steadily, the robot approached the desk, which the blue robot, whose name I guess is GW3N, was hiding behind. The red robot got within 3 feet of GW3N before one of my spider drones decided to approach the robot, whom I'm going to call Red from now on. I know, I am an absolute genius on creativity. Then, Red yelled, "Get out of my damn way, you stupid drone!" as they kick my poor spider, which makes it go flying into the far wall, where my other spiders scuttled over to see what was causing all the noise and to help the kicked one back onto its feet. I don't know who Red thinks they are or why they're after GW3N, but I will not tolerate them attacking one of my little friends for no reason. I mentally seethe in anger. which my other spiders seemed to agree with as all 8 of them gathered up and charged at Red, who had turned their back to them as they went back to searching for GW3N. My spiders quickly take advantage of Red's carelessness and begin chomping at their exposed and slightly less armored back. In fact, one of my spiders began grabbing onto Red's arms and legs, which caused much disbalance. "Get off of me, you damned beasts!" Red bellows in frustration as they grab onto one of my drones with a free hand and, using their club, slams the poor drone into the wall, which left a large cave in its torso, leaving the spider crippled. In response to one of their brothers getting whacked into a wall with a club, the remaining 7 spiders began to chomp even more vigorously at Red's armor, or trying to force Red to drop their club. Most of their chomps did nearly nothing to Red's bulky plating, and none were able to make Red drop their club, but enough went through to force them to not spare a glance, as GW3N got up from her hiding space upon noticing that her chaser was getting mauled by more than a half-dozen spiders. The robot quickly assessed the situation and decided to take advantage of the distraction my spiders were making, and swiftly body-checked Red to the ground, which must have hurt for both sides. GW3N was the first to get back up, as Red was still forced to deal with my spiders' constant chomps. This allowed for GW3N to saddle up to Red before they slammed their foot into Red's stomach more than what was likely necessary in order to prove a point. Not quite ready to kill something that could talk, I order my spider drones to stop attacking and to simply restrain the robot, which they begrudgingly do so. Crawling off the main chassis of Red, my spiders begin splitting off in pairs to hold down the thing's legs and arms while GW3N walks over. GW3N seems to deliberate for a few moments before sighing and muttering under their breath, "It's not worth it," before yelling, "Leave and don't come back!" which Red responds by hastily getting up and sprinting out of the room while my spiders jumped off them. GW3N seems to visibly relax once Red leaves visual range, but then remembers that they are nearly surrounded by my spiders, who were, not a few moments before, gnawing on Red's metal plates. This, however, did not seem to perturb GW3N as they squatted down to my spiders, who were now nursing their wounds. "Thanks for the help, little guys. Maker knows what would have happened if you didn't show up." Then, notice the drone who was crippled by Red. They apologize with a, "Sorry about your friend." Speaking of the crippled spider, I see that a couple of my less damaged drones had walked over to them and were now using some of the materials left over from their initial construction to replace the dented plates and internal machinery. This left an icon floating above the drone, which stated that they were being repaired and it would take another 10 minutes until they would be functional again. Well, it is good to know that you guys can repair each other if they get damaged. I sent over a few more spiders to aid in the repairs before floating back over to the drone works and ordering up a couple more spiders. This, however, led to an alert popping up in front of me stating that I was nearing maximum drone administrative capacity and that I needed to construct a core in order to facilitate more drones. A core, you say? Now, how would I construct such a thing? And as if hearing my question, a notification rears in front of me stating that I did not possess a blueprint for a core and thus would either need to find said blueprint or to discover an already built core which I could take over. Before I could ponder this further, GW3N got the attention of one of my spiders, who was wandering about. "Hey, do you guys mind me staying here?" If it's not a problem, that is. They want to stay here? I suppose it could not hurt to have someone with actual hands here to help with work around here. Although, I have a feeling that Red might come back to exact revenge or something which is less than appealing, especially since I am apparently capped out on my drones. I cannot even begin constructing a core to increase my drone limit yet, and I doubt that GW3N just so happened to know how to either. Not that it would matter since I doubt I have the required materials to make it from scratch. Maybe there are some more materials or a blueprint further down into the factory, but that would require GW3N to open the door. Sighing to myself about how Red might pose a future annoyance, I tell my drone to give an affirmative answer to GW3N that they can stay as long as they help out around the factory. The spider does this by chittering in their strange binary-like language which GW3N seems to understand as she thanks the spider. I then ordered the spider to get GW3N's attention, which they do by using their front legs to tug on GW3N's leg while emitting a beeping sound. GW3N looked down curiously at my drone before realizing what they wanted as the spider in question began scratching at the door like a puppy who wanted in. I chuckle internally at the thought of a spider the size of a puppy chasing its non-existent tail, while GW3N walks up to the door and grips the handle. Then, the blue robot unceremoniously swings the door wide open, which I began to peer into the newly revealed hallway. The walls were made of the same kind of metal-reinforced concrete that the other rooms were made of, but unfortunately the hallway was devoid of any sources of lights. This meant that anything farther than a half dozen feet away from the door was masked in a blanket of black nothingness, which would make traversing here slightly annoying. This did not stop my 5 spiders from scuttling down into the dark without any hesitation, although I was not complaining, since their joints glowed just bright enough to light up a couple feet in front of them, which meant I could now see. Soon, my spiders arrived at the end of the hallway, where they were met by a door on both sides. Above the doors was a sign denoting that the door on the left led to the storeroom and the other led to the staircase. GW3N opened the door on the left, which revealed a, still unlit, room filled with a number of shelves and crates, along with the noises of something scurrying inside the room. Peering into the other door, I could see 2 staircases which went up and down. Inspecting further, I saw that the stairs leading up had a bunch of collapsed rubble which blocked me from going any further. This left me with 2 choices, either to go into the storeroom or down the stairs. Deciding to explore the first floor before going deeper into the factory, I ordered my drones to move into the room and check for what was making that scurrying noise. As they entered the room, they were met by more than a dozen small rat-looking drones, which were rummaging through one of the crates. Then, as if just noticing my drones, the rats stopped what they were doing and began growling. Then, the rats jumped off the crate and charged my spiders, who immediately braced themselves and prepared to strike back at their attackers. The 2 lines clashed against each other, and it was immediately evident that my spiders had the upper hand against the much smaller rats, even if they were outnumbered 3 to 1. The rats' small bites and scratches did not seem to be strong enough to inflict much more than surface damage, which was not the case for the spider bites, which seemed to be able to disable or outright snap the rats in half. Their advantage was further pushed into victory as GW3N decided to help out by stomping on one of the rats, which caused the others to panic due to the fact that they had absolutely no chance against GW3N. This panic soon boiled over into full retreat, which was swiftly taken advantage of by my spiders, who used their front legs to grab the fleeing rats before they quickly ended them. And with that, the battle, if you could call it that, was over, as the last of the rats were either executed or managed to run away fast enough to avoid the death sentence by the hands of my spiders. Looking upon the carnages, I could see that my spiders had taken out 12 of the 15 or so rats which attacked them, while only sustaining minimal damages in most cases. The outlier was the spider who was fighting at the very end of the formation, and thus had almost no support from their brothers in arms, which had resulted in the rats somehow managing to cut something important, which left one of their legs lying limp on the ground, which was severely hampering their ability to move. Thankfully, my spiders were able to patch them back up after a few minutes of repairs, which was nice. Floating over to some of the destroyed rats, I could see that they had dozens of tiny antennae all across their body, along with 2 slightly larger radar dishes, which replaced where their ears would have been. Then, as I was inspecting the corpse of a particularly intact corpse, a description screen appeared in front of me, which displayed information on the rat drones, which were apparently called ATRS, or All-Terrain Reconnaissance Scouts. The description stated that ATRS were made to be cheap, mass-produced, disposable scouts, which could be sent in large quantities into urban areas and would act as miniature sensor beacons, which would relay information to their allies. It also stated that their programming was exceptionally basic, not needing much more than orders to find an undisturbed corner where they could still transmit stuff, which meant that they took very little computing power to keep operating. These traits came at a cost, however, as the ATRS were incredibly fragile and were pitiful in combat due to the lack of any sort of protection or advanced weaponry. The only military application that they could be used for, aside from simply scouting, was to act as an early warning system when enemy units moved near them. Having a few scouts could not hurt, and the fact that they were cheap and did not take up too much bandwidth was further incentive to get at least a couple of them. With that taken care of, I was now free to begin snooping around in all of these crates, which were sure to have at least a few goodies that I could use. After a few minutes of having GW3N open various crates and cataloging the contents of them, I eventually calculated that the crates possessed a decent amount of materials, which would certainly be helpful whenever I found the blueprint for a core, which unfortunately was not one of the things stored in the crates. Welp, time to continue the search. Slowly but surely, my spiders and GW3N walked or crawled down the staircase, which was pitch black asides from the slight glow that came off my spiders. The walls slowly turned from reinforced concrete into simply just hard stone, which I guessed meant that my drones were now fully underground. Along the walls were dozens of cables and wires snaking down into the darkness below, before splitting off into the now visible hallway. The new hallway had a series of doors which lined both sides of it, and after peeking into a couple, They were filled with various electronics and spare circuit boards. Continuing down the tunnel was another set of double doors, which looked to be much more reinforced than the previous ones, although this time the doors were partially open already. Once GW3N pushed the reinforced bulkhead of a door open, I could now see that the room behind them housed a large spherical structure which was contained within a shattered glass case. Near the strange sphere were a half dozen or so metal rings which were severely dented or even cracked in half, some being completely shattered with dozens of fragments scattered across their broken glass container. Floating over to the strange sphere, a screen pops up in front of me which states that this pile of broken machinery is a damaged core, which required extensive repairs and replacement parts to become fully functional again. Along with this information, there was a list of various materials which were required to repair the core. Those materials included a large amount of metals, more than I currently had available, and a bunch of electronic components which I could take from the rooms in the hallway. Then, I noticed a small button on the screen which said, "Highlight nearby usable components." Clicking on the button, the screen faded away, and things started to glow with a bright light blue glow. GW3N did not seem to notice the change, however my spiders seemed to be able to. However, they did not seem very surprised by the sudden change in vision. Alright, this makes things easier. Calling for any of my drones who were not doing anything too important, I began ordering them to begin moving the highlighted materials to the damaged core and to begin construction. As I did this, a couple more of my spiders along with the newly constructed ones began to move towards the closest of the glowing material and started dragging it towards the stairs. The ones who were already at the core began grabbing up the various scattered fragments and started to weld them back together with GW3N, catching on to what was happening and helped gather the various fragments. Then, while one of the upstairs spiders was grabbing a hunk of metal, some familiar rodent-like figure appeared from somewhere inside the storage room and immediately began charging towards the spider. That's odd. I only remember 3 escaping, but now there were 4 of them. Perhaps there was a couple hiding somewhere in the storage room. A couple of the spiders nearby were able to lend assistance to the first spider, and soon the rats were taken care of again. With that in mind, however, I decided to leave one of the spiders there to make sure there are not any more of those left in the room. Soon enough, the majority of the materials were delivered to the construction site, where my spiders worked diligently to bring the core back online. Above the core was an icon, not unlike the one which was above my spider who was being repaired, which stated that it would take around half a day before the core would be repaired back to functionality, and it would take a couple days of continuous maintenance for the core to fully acclimate to its optimal settings. Some time while my spiders were working, they told GW3N that their assistance was no longer needed, and they could go take a break or something, which they did by claiming one of the rooms in the underground hallway, which had been cleared out during the collection of materials. In this room, GW3N seemed to have made herself comfortable, even taking the time to grab a chair or two from the main room. With the majority of my drones working on the core and the others hewling various chunks of scrap to the refinery for more materials for said core, I did not have much left to do aside from just waiting around. Then I remembered that I could build a couple of those new scout rats, and so, using the little bit of bandwidth I had left along with taking a couple chunks of metal from the pile downstairs, I ordered the construction of 3 rats. The 3 drones were fabricated surprisingly quickly, only taking a couple of minutes each. Not that I am complaining. With them ready and waiting, I now had a decision to make, that being where to take my newly constructed rats. I could try and have them crawl through the small crevices between the chunks of rubble at the stairs which go up, or I could have them set off to explore the great outdoors. On one hand, the rubble might collapse on the rats while they are crawling through them, but on the other half of the things which had come from the outside have been rather hostile. The latter point was thoroughly countered by the fact that I only had 2 subjects to go off of, while the former was only a hypothetical and might just be false. Eventually, I just decided to take the simple option and ordered my rats to exit through the front doors and to begin exploring the outside world. However, when I tried to follow them out of the factory, I seemed to hit an invisible wall, which blocked me from leaving the factory walls. My rats did not seem to be affected by the walls and were curious why I seemed distressed. Reaching down to pet the rat in reassurance that I was fine, I was sucked into the drone upon my non-existent hand contacting the drone. Then, after a few seconds of nausea, I noticed that the world seems a lot bigger than I remember, and quickly I also noticed that I cannot control my body either. Then I realized that I am now inside of one of my scout rats, as another scout looks towards the one I am currently inhabiting with a curious expression. Well, this is weird. Is my first thought as the scout rat I am inside of begins moving fully outside, and was immediately blinded by the brightness of the sun. Then, once my eyes adjusted, I saw that it was not sun, but rather suns, as my eyes laid upon two twin suns which were situated right next to each other. Well, that's certainly interesting, although I should not be too surprised. Those two not-so-cosplayers did say that I was going to be in a different world. Now that my eyes are fully adjusted, I began gazing upon what seems to be the ruins in the outskirts of a city, as the buildings were much more spread out compared to the much more crammed-together constructs in the Hive City where I lived before I died. Still not quite used to the thought that I am technically already dead. Anyways, far off in the distance I could see what looked like the city proper, which looked like an indomitable mountain from where I was positioned. Looking over the ruins near the factory building, I could see that they were grown over by grass and vines, and from where my scout was standing, I could spot strange-looking cats of various colors with large floppy tails. The strange cats were wandering on two legs, rather than the traditional four, and seemed to be exploring the ruins, and some were even coming out of the sewer grates. My scout rats approached the colorful, and a pale white one poked them with the dull end of their spear. Up close, they looked quite cute, and I was thinking about simply having my scouts following around the colorful cats. Well, that was until one of them looked into the air and pointed, which caused the strange cats to scatter and hide in the sewer tunnels and ruins while my drone stood there confused. Then the scout I was inhabiting decided that, looking where the cat had pointed and the reason for their panic, was made evident as my scout and I could make out a flying figure shooting down straight for us. Crap.